All right, this is our SOL9 lecture. We'll be talking about the Industrial Revolution. We'll also get into, we'll talk about imperialism. So the Industrial Revolution starts in England, all right, and spread to the rest of Western Europe and the United States. So here's the big why, and most historians will resist the temptation to say something in history was inevitable, but the Industrial Revolution's as close as it gets. All of the population, the resources necessary was there, and you know, all in the right place at the right time. Now, there are a small group of historians that wonder why Rome never industrialized. So, didn't have to happen at this time, but it did. Let's take a look at why. All right, here's England before the Industrial Revolution. All right, and these little green blobs are urban centers. And what you're going to find are English cities that are by rivers, like the Thames, okay? Or, as is the case up here in northern England, by coal fields, all right? The natural resources necessary, sources of power, sources of fuel to drive those factories. So the Industrial Revolution is spurred by technological development, originally in England because of natural resources like coal and iron ore. Water power and coal are going to fuel these new machines. We'll talk about what machines specifically. But fast moving water is going to be used, and then later on you'll have triple reduction steam engines that are fired by coal that will also later produce electricity. Rivers are going to be needed for inland transportation, and you're going to need harbors so merchant ships can take those finished goods out to world markets. Natural resources are anything we harvest from nature, okay, the raw materials. Here we go. I think this is the Thames River. There we go. Okay. Originated in England because of the invention and improvement of the steam engine. All right. Who invented the steam engine? The idea of the steam engine had been around for a really long time, and you can see it described in Roman Egypt in the 1st century CE. There was a design for a steam engine amongst Leonardo da Vinci's papers, so the concept had been around for a while. For our purposes, we're going to say that the inventor of the steam engine is James Watt. More on that later. You need the technology, there's a supportive economy and workforce, a willingness by wealthy people to invest in what we call capital. So that's the machines, the transportation mechanisms like big ships and trains. A lot of money has to go in up front in order to have these industrial processes. And so you need investors. People are going to have to put up a lot of money with the belief that they're going to make some money. You need political stability. You need stable governments because nobody's going to invest if they're worried about it all getting, burnt down in a peasant revolt or a foreign invader is going to sack the city or something like that. So you had all the factors of production that were needed. Okay. And like I said, there's a small group of historians that are like, well, hey, there were times where the Roman Empire had all this. Why didn't they industrialize? It's kind of a weird question. It's interesting to think about. Land, labor, and wealth is required. So from England, it spread to the rest of Europe and the United States. It's going to diffuse outward from England. All right. By 1700, small farms covered England. And wealthy landowners are going to buy out all those small village farmers. This is called the British Enclosure Movement. This is because small farms are no longer really efficient. Remember, and I've mentioned this before, a prerequisite to having an industrial revolution is to have an agricultural revolution. So there were improved farming methods. There are machines that can be used to perform agriculture, like the mechanical reaper, invented by Cyrus McCormick, like the seed drill, the mechanical seed drill, which is a mechanized seed planter. Anyway, think about it. Like if you're going to have thousands of people working in factories, you're going to need mechanized agriculture so that less farmers can feed more people. Okay, so your farmer to worker ratio is going to be fewer farmers, so maybe a farmer per 1,000 people or something like that. So you have to have this agricultural revolution to have your industrial revolution. It's important. So after buying all the land, it was enclosed. So that allowed for larger fields to be cultivated more efficiently using these machines, hence the name, enclosures. Landowners are also going to start to experiment with more productive seeds. So these are hybrid seeds that are going to become very important later on, and harvesting methods. Higher crop yields means less people can support a larger population, means you can have your industrial revolution. This is a factory that I doodled. Okay. All right. So new agricultural methods are introduced, mechanized agriculture. Large landowners force small farmers to become either tenant farmers, as in they are renting a part of that land. They work basically year round, buy their materials and seeds from the company store, and usually end up in debt to the company store. So tenant farmer is, we call them sharecroppers in U.S. history. It's not a very beneficial. Often it's an exploitative relationship. Or more likely, they're going to move to the city and work in a factory. What does this lead to in cities? Huge growth, rapid growth in populations. Industrial cities are characterized by rapid growth. They grow too fast, though. The cities, the services, the sewer and water and garbage disposal can't keep up with the population growth. Industrial cities are not nice places to live. More on that later. All right, this is one of those machines that's going to revolutionize the textile industry. This is a spinning jenny. All right, it turns, you're basically weaving, yarn or thread or whatever into cloth. Okay, so Britain's textile industry clothed the world in wool, linen, and cotton. It's the first industry to industrialize. It's also the first industry to industrialize in the United States, in Lowell, Massachusetts. This is like late 1700 to early 1800 that we see the industrialization of the textile industry. Lots of major machines modernized the cotton industry. You have the spinning jenny, the flying shuttle, and the cotton gin. All right, this one right here is for the harvesting of cotton, but the spinning jenny and the flying shuttle are for spinning the wool and the cotton into cloth. And what they end up doing is they combine these two machines on something called a water frame, which is, basically a water-powered sort of frame that will automatically power these machines. And then they put lots and lots of these machines in big buildings called factories, and you end up with big factories producing lots of cloth really quickly.
All right, so the flying shuttle is another one of those machines that they would attach to the water frame, and it basically has like a bobbin that flies back and forth. So as that spinning jenny, drives that, that weaving process, this like allows the bobbin to fly back and forth, so the thread is sort of automatically supplied. So it's invented by John Kay, and it doubles the work of the weaver. All right, and it's first operated by hand. But remember, they take this thing, they take the spinning jenny, they put it on the water frame. All right, so the spinning jenny is invented by James Hargreaves, and it was actually the result of a cash prize that attracted people to invent a spinner that could keep up with the flying shuttle. So, like, you have one machine, it's very quick. They needed another one to be able to keep up with it. This process is going to continue. All right. So he named the spinning wheel after his daughter, and it basically allowed one spinner to work 8 threads at a time. It's also first operated by hand, but it's going to be automated pretty soon. All right, so you got Spinning Jenny by James Hargreaves. And so when it comes to cotton, let me see, here we go. All right, so I might have a better picture. This is a better picture. So the process of harvesting cotton is labor intensive, and the process of sort of preparing raw cotton to go to you know, the textile factory is also, so there's like little bowls and you know, seeds and things like that that are in the raw cotton that had to be removed by hand. That's very time consuming. So it would take, you know, people a long time to separate those materials from the cotton. So this thing basically has like a comb, and you have a hand crank. You feed the raw cotton in to the, there's a big hopper that attaches to this thing, and you just dump baskets of cotton into that hopper, and it feeds down into this little chute. You turn the hand crank pulls the cotton through the comb, and all the junk that you don't want in the cotton comes out the other side. So it's invented by Eli Whitney. All right. Remember that the vast majority of the cotton in the world is coming from the American South. All right, and the textile industry had industrialized, and so the demand for cotton has increased dramatically. But cotton is not, you know, necessarily an economically feasible crop yet because it's so difficult to remove the seeds from raw cotton. It's very, very hard work. So the cotton gin is invented in 1793 to speed up the process. All right. So cotton production skyrocketed from 1.5 million pounds in 1790 to 85 million pounds in 1810. There's another picture of it. I'll leave that up for a second. Now, what's worth noting here is that there's more to this than just an increase in cotton production. The demand for slavery, you know, slavery wasn't going away on its own, but there was definitely a waning in the demand for slavery, especially, you know, in the Upper South. And so this cotton gin is going to have a couple of consequences. One is that, like I said, the demand for cotton and cotton production is going to skyrocket, but the labor force on all those cotton plantations are enslaved African Americans. So cotton is going to drive the demand for slavery and really just cause the institution of slavery in the South to explode. So by the time we get to 1860, you have 9 million people living in the South, and half of the people living in the South are enslaved men, women, and children. And cotton represents 60% of U.S. exports. So, you know, money in northern banks is from the, you know, result of cotton produced by enslaved people. You know, the Atlantic world is supplied by money, you know, from cotton produced by enslaved people. So the cotton gin has the unfortunate consequence of causing the untold suffering of millions, just by causing the South to turn almost exclusively to cotton production. Okay, all right. So technological advances that produced the Industrial Revolution continued. So we get the steam engine, which remember we said is invented by James Watt. You could argue otherwise. That's in 1765. James Watt was Scottish. And so prior to his faster and more efficient improvement, the steam engine used too much fuel. You could say James Watt invented the first practical steam engine. All right, his would work faster and more efficiently by burning less fuel. So he built a better engine to be used in factories and transportation, and that means With the steam engine, you don't necessarily have to be by a water source, although typically you're still going to find factories by water sources. Um, but the steam engine means factories have power. All right, you can kind of see the way it works here. You've got a, where the water boils, builds pressure, right, which turns a turbine, which turns a flywheel, which turns whatever machine you want to hook it to. I mean, later on, you can turn a dynamo with this thing and make electricity. So, interesting stuff. The Bessemer process comes along later in the 19th century, and this is for the mass production of steel. So the knowledge to make steel and steel production had been around, but steel was very expensive to make. It took a long time to make a small amount, but there are advantages to steel. Steel is stronger and lighter than iron. You just can't, there's no practical way to use it on a large scale until the Bessemer process. The Bessemer process uses huge blast furnaces that burn the impurities, the carbon impurities, out of iron, thus mass producing steel. All right, so it's the first inexpensive process for creating steel out of iron, burns the excess carbon impurities out of molten iron, making steel. Okay, Bessemer process. These are the blast furnaces that I was talking about, and some of these things are like multiple stories high, just behemoth, monstrous things. You look at like Andrew Carnegie's Homestead steel plant, it like towers into the sky, and they call it a blast furnace because when it burns off the impurities, there's just like an eruption that comes out of the tops of these things. I mean, to work around them must have been really something. Definitely not great, a great place to work. Okay, and you can kind of see the Bessemer process. This is not Henry Bessemer, by the way. This is, who do you think this is? This is Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie is going to take the Bessemer process back to America, and he is going to become America's steel giant, right? So he is going to make steel, and he's going to become one of the wealthiest men in America doing it. And if you think that he looks like Santa Claus in this picture, you should, because that is what he was going through it for. Andrew Carnegie always wanted to look congenial and kind of have a Santa Claus look so that people would kind of have a good opinion about him. But he's actually ruthless. Andrew Carnegie is ruthless. He has no problem ruining competitors. He'll do whatever it takes to succeed. He exploits his workers by working them long hours for practically no pay. When there's a strike at his Homestead steel plant, he sends in mercenaries to put it down. It doesn't really work out quite that way, but Andrew Carnegie is cutthroat. Okay. All right, so there's also advancements in science and medicine during the Industrial Revolution. Let's take a look. We were going to get a smallpox vaccine, which is fortunate, right? Okay, this is developed by Edward Jenner. It's the first successful vaccine against smallpox. Vaccines are one of those sort of things that we kind of take for granted today. We don't really put a lot of thought into them, but they are one of the foundations of modern civilization. So vaccinations, the ability to vaccinate against ourselves against diseases, and if you haven't been able to tell that from this most recent pandemic, I mean, imagine these waves of pandemics used to rack populations and really nasty stuff like smallpox, typhus, and all these really serious illnesses. So something like a smallpox vaccine is a pretty big deal. I don't think that you guys have to get them anymore. I had to get one in the military. Okay. All right, so bacteria are discovered by Louis Pasteur. He's a French chemist, and he the germ theory of disease was developed in the mid 1800s. The idea that bacteria cause disease was developed. So he discovered it while examining the fermentation process of alcohol. All right. Um, Basically, like learn how they the bacteria from the yeast develop. So he developed a pasteurization process to kill germs in various liquids, including milk. And this is a pretty big deal. The pasteurization of milk is going to save thousands and thousands of lives. One of the leading causes of miscarriage in the early 20th century was unpasteurized milk. All right. We'll look at the impacts of the Industrial Revolution rather on industrialized countries. All right, so there's going to be a sharp population increase. Standards of living are going to come up for many, but remember I told you that industrial cities are pretty nasty places to live. And so if you're a factory worker, your standard of living is going to be just off. Transportation is going to improve. We're going to see urbanization. What is urbanization? Well, to give you an idea, in the early 1800s, the vast majority of Americans, we'll use the United States as an example here. The vast majority of Americans lived in rural areas on farms. By the time we get to the late 19th centuries, the 1870s, 1880s, most Americans live in cities. And in our current point in our history, most humans in the world live in cities, live in cities. So, we live in Middlesex, it's fairly rural. We're really the exception. Humans are an urban species. So we're going to see a rise in environmental pollution. Education is going to increase, especially in the U.S. We're going to see the dissatisfaction of working class people with their working conditions and living conditions, and we're going to see the growth of the middle class. All right. So transportation, like I said, is going to improve. Robert Fulton is going to invent the steamboat, which leads to transportation of goods and people up and down rivers. Um, uh, Fulton's invention is going to make it make a way for you to transport large amounts of goods up and down rivers. Though these things do have a sort of distressing tendency to explode. George Stephenson built a steam locomotive called the Rocket in England. All right, this led to widespread development of railroads for transportation of goods, and roads were improved. All-weather roads, like macadamized roads, with drainage systems were invented to eliminate the problem of mud. So improved roadways, railroads, canals, steamboats means better transportation means more trade. Okay, so you can see here's the Rocket, Fulton steamboat, right? Mechanized, earth-moving equipment to sort of flatten out. This is like a cobblestone street, so it's pretty old kind of method of road building meets a kind of new method of road building. Interesting stuff. All right. Like I said, there's going to be a lot of environmental degradation, the sharp increase in that. So this is what you've got to keep in mind is that this is a time where the attitude is very laissez-faire, which is a French term for hands-off. So governments did not seek to regulate industry. It's the government gets involved with industry, but the government gets involved with industry on their behalf. So like the government gives industries lots of money. They give hundreds of thousands of acres of land to railroad companies. They'll send the military in when there's a strike to break the strike up, but they will not intervene to set a work day, to 8 hours. They will not intervene to set a minimum wage. They won't intervene to regulate working conditions, at least not yet. Some people are going to have to get really upset. A lot of people are going to have to die before the government is compelled by popular opinion to come in and do that. But when it comes to regulating things like that, the government keeps its hands off. It stays laissez-faire. And the same can be said for the environment. So there was no rule that said that factories couldn't just dump their waste. You might have a discharge pipe and the waste just goes right into this river, and that was perfectly legal, and there was nothing anybody could do about it. And in fact, that's most likely what would happen, because that's the least expensive way of disposing of the waste. So it's eventually going to be realized that some government intervention to ensure the survival of the natural, environment is going to be required. Okay, so the average worker spent about 14 hours a day on the job, 14 to 17 hours a day on the job, about 6 days a week. Factory owners wanted to increase production and keep the machines going. Now, these factories were not clean places. They were poorly lit. The air was full of all sorts of particulates, and nobody wore a respirator or anything like that. The machines were exposed, so there's exposed flywheels and belts. A loose piece of clothing gets caught in the machine, you're probably going to lose an arm. And workers were frequently maimed and killed by the machines. And there's no such thing as workman's compensation. So if you get fired, like let's say you lose an arm, they're like, okay, well, we only hire people with 2 arms, so you're fired. And there was nothing to protect you from that. There's no government program, no protection to aid injured workers. Coal mines are particularly dangerous. If you haven't noticed, I mean, even in our modern times, you can't go more than a year or two without hearing a story about an incident in a coal mine in which the miners were either trapped or killed. And that's with all of the modern technology that we have today. So imagine what 19th century coal mines, before electricity must have been like. And keep in mind that most of the folks that worked in coal mines were children. In fact, a lot of workers were children. Look at these kids right here. So they're working, this is like a power loom, okay? Basically like a giant version of the spinning jenny / flying shuttle. And they're, 6, 7 years old. And they work between 14 and 17 hours a day. These kids don't see natural light very much. So they get up very early in the morning, they go to the factory, they work until nighttime, they go home and they go to bed. They can't even leave the factory for meals. So they eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner where? Right here. They eat beside their machines. And that's their life, day in and day out, 6 to 7 days a week. And it's better to hire children because you can pay children less. And so child labor becomes a common aspect of the Industrial Revolution. Oh, and they would think nothing of whipping these kids if they didn't work fast enough. So the person, the driver in the plant, the foreman or whatever, if the kids slowed down, they would whip them. All right, check out these kids. All right, what do you think their profession is? All right, these are the breaker boys. So these kids work, I believe they work in a steel plant. All right, you've got kids this age and younger working in steel plants and coal mines, and so child labor is fairly widespread. The new middle class is going to transform the social structure of Britain and other industrialized nations. So a growing middle class is going to have major ramifications moving forward. All right. With the Industrial Revolution came an increased demand for raw materials from the Americas, Asia, and Africa. So advancements in technology produced the Industrial Revolution. Advancements in science and medicine altered the lives of people living in new industrial cities, and cultural change is kind of fun. Why are we going to get cultural change as a result of advances in technology, advances in science, and advances in medicine? All right. Uh, so look at the nature of work. Check out these folks right here are on strike. Okay, so between like 1880 and 1900 in the United States alone, there's about 30,000 strikes. So this is a time period where people typically talk about the labor movement, or you might hear people talk about the labor capital dispute. By capital, what we mean the factory owners. But essentially, workers are becoming more united. They're collectively organizing. I mean, this had been going on for a little while, but you're getting a larger middle class with greater access to education. Um, Technology is improving, and so more people are paying attention to this kind of thing. You know, mass media is on the rise, and so people can look at pictures of working conditions and living conditions, and and sort of be inspired to support changes, and so strikes become frequent. All right, so let's look at the effects of the Industrial Revolution. So we get an increase in population, education, and the middle class. All right, we talked about okay, for new advancements in science like Jenner and Pasteur. All right, um, we talked about dangerous working conditions in the factories and the coal mines, urbanization, the rapid growth of cities. Standard of living increases, basically how much you can buy, transportation improvements, things like trains, steamboats, canals, railroads, improved roads, the rise of revolution, and improvements to steel production. We had to throw in, yeah, to make it fit. But anyway, spells industry. Okay, so the Industrial Revolution had an impact on the structure and function of the family. All right, first the factory system was in cottages. You had the cottage industry. So everything, basically everything was produced by artisans out of their homes. And typically anything that you own that you purchased probably came within a few miles of your own home. You might purchase one pair of shoes and you might wear that same pair of shoes like most of your adult life, because the process behind shoemaking was so extensive. Like you would have a shoemaker who would spend their life like making shoes, and would take an apprentice who would take years and years and years to train that apprentice in the trade of shoemaking. Well, now the same process is going to be done in mass in factories. And one consequence of that is, well, people are going to be able to afford newer shoes, more shoes. It also means that the artisan shoemaker is going to, end up working in that factory. All right. So the cottage industry is displaced by the new factory system, rather. All right. So farm number one, farm number two, farm number three, you finish at the town, right? Sheep farms, farm number one. Here's the merchant's route, right? Cottage industry. Basically small farms, cottages, produce goods and give them to the surrounding kind of countryside. Like everything comes from, a short distance. It's all made by hand, and this is going to go away. All right, now it's going to be the factory, goes to the worker's house, goes to the worker's house, goes to the worker's house. It goes out and is transported all around the world. All right. So work in the factories was harsh. Men competed with women and children for jobs and wages. Child labor was widespread, and I already talked a little bit about that. That kept the cost of production low and the profits high. You could pay kids less. Owners of mines and factories had huge control over the lives of their laborers. They would lock them in the factories if they hadn't met production quotas. There was no protection. So literally, like they could say, well, you know, you can go home, but if you go home, you're fired. And there were always people willing to replace you. Working conditions were awful. So, there's a famous book written by Upton Sinclair called The Jungle that talks a little bit about working conditions. Upton Sinclair visited the meat packing factories in Chicago, and he wrote a book about the horrid conditions that the workers endured there. He wrote about men shearing sheep with acid and their hands being eaten off, men falling into giant vats of boiling oil and ending up in the sausage, and all sorts of just terrible, vile stuff, right? And the American public was really shocked. And Upton Sinclair famously said, I aimed for their hearts, but I hit them in the stomach. So people were just like horrified and disgusted at how nasty these meatpacking plants were, that they demanded change. And so Upton Sinclair was a muckraker. Muckrakers are going to play a big role in exposing sort of the evils of society, things like bad working conditions, bad living conditions. But anyway, that went a long way in improving conditions in factories, at least in that particular industry. So due to new inventions, did the need for slave labor increase or decrease? What do you think? We already talked about this a little bit. The cotton gin increased the demand for slave labor on plantations because it made cotton production cheaper. And so cotton was in hot demand. Textile factories across the world wanted it. And even though the slave trade was outlawed, the slave population was self-sustaining. In the United States, the turn to cotton production causes a major phenomenon that historians sometimes call the Second Middle Passage. And so from the invention of the cotton gin until the elimination of slavery, if you were in the South, it would not have been unusual to encounter a line of enslaved African Americans chained together being marched south. So what was happening is in states like Virginia, North Carolina and Maryland, they had started to turn away from tobacco production toward less labor-intensive crops. And so they were selling their slaves to the Deep South. This is where the term "sell you down river" comes from. And so at any moment, you could be ripped away from your family and transported, to New Orleans, never to see them again. And many, many families were separated. And this is the largest internal migration in U.S. history. Millions of African Americans, shift over this time period from the Upper South to the Deep South, to certainly harsher conditions in the Deep South as a result of the growing demand for slavery in the Deep South and the waning demand for slavery in the Upper South. Now, despite all that, Virginia will continue to have more slaves than any other state all the way until the end of slavery. So Virginia had more slaves, had a larger institution of slavery than any other state, even when the southern states turned to cotton production. Women and children entering the workforce were a source of cheap labor. All right, so there are going to be reforms, okay, progressive reforms to end child labor. Education is going to expand, and so there's a growing belief that those kids should be in school. Women increased demands for suffrage. What is suffrage? So suffrage refers to voting rights. So the women's suffrage movement is a worldwide movement. In the United States, it begins in 1848 with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. There are women's rights activists all over the world. They're going to fight for women's equality, especially the right to vote. All right. Let's skip over this. Labor unions are going to emerge, and workers are going to organize strikes to demand better wages and improved working conditions. They're going to push for the government to make laws to improve the lives of workers. So things like a set work day. All right, if you work, you might get something called overtime. Right? You know, overtime rewards you for working more than 40 hours a week, but it also discourages employers from overworking their employees. Workers wanted rights. They use collective bargaining to get their rights. So what is collective bargaining? Well, think about it like this. Like, on my own, if I'm a factory worker, I don't really have any leverage. Like if I go and I say, hey, you know, our working conditions here aren't great or the hours are terrible, they can just fire me. There's plenty of people waiting to take my job, right? But what if like all the workers in the factory get together and make the same demand? Well, theoretically, they could replace without too much trouble all the workers in the factory. They really could do that. But what if like all workers in an industry banded together? So what if there was a steel workers union or a coal miners union? And when one factory went on strike, they would be supported by workers across that entire industry. Well, now collectively, they've got some bargaining power and they can win some concessions. There's going to be thousands of strikes in the late 19th and early 20th century. They're going to be violent. People are going to get killed. The military gets sent in to put down these strikes. So the labor capital conflict is in many ways a very real conflict. But they win concessions. Ultimately, better working conditions, a set work day, later on a minimum wage. And so that's pretty important. The Industrial Revolution is placing all kinds of new demands on the labor of men, women, and children. So workers organized labor unions to fight for improved conditions and workers' rights. All right. It's around this time that we get two different sort of theories. So capitalism is theorized and communism is theorized. So let's take a look at what these two things are. Okay. So an economic system is a system of managing the economy. The economy, as said, the way the government or the state manages the production of wealth. All right, how does it? Our government manages the production of wealth. It has a couple of different ways that it does that through regulatory means, by raising and lowering interest rates and things like that. So governments use money to help people or provide for them. And they can also, increase or decrease the money supply. So we have a Federal Reserve that raises or lowers interest rates to increase or decrease the money supply. That's monetary policy. They can set taxes. They can provide subsidies. So that basically provide money so they can help out, businesses and things like that. They can help out individuals. So for example, you can get a federally subsidized student loan. So you can get a student loan that the federal government helps pay for, and go to college. Well, why would the government help pay for your student loan? Well, they look at it as an investment. They're going to spend a little bit of money on you today, and in the long term, they're going to get that money back because by getting an education, you're going to be a better producer in the economy. So there's different ways to look at this. Anyway, capitalism is an economic system, and there's a strong belief in individual ownership and in competition. The theory is that if everybody is competing, all right, sort of selfishly competing, it benefits everyone. much of this theory is put forth by Adam Smith. Okay, his writings sort of lay all of this out. All right, here he is, Adam Smith. So, what's good about capitalism? Well, you get freedom in choices. You can work wherever, you can buy what you want, and pretty much do what you want. And if you're successful, you can be very successful. So you can become extraordinarily wealthy in a capitalist economic system. You also have to consider that competition breeds innovation. So if I am competing with you, I have a few choices. I have to make a cheaper product, which could work. Um, I have to make a higher quality product. Okay, if I can't make it cheaper, or if it's the same price, then mine has to be better than yours along some criterion. This is the reason why we see capitalist economies innovate more, whereas communist economies tended to stagnate over time. So capitalist economies produce the automatic washer and dryer, color TV, the automatic transmission, stealth aircraft, and that really comes down to competition. Companies were vying for people's dollars. They were fighting for people's dollars. Now, it's important to point out that in the late 19th and early 20th century, our economy wasn't very competitive. So we had a handful of, Rockefeller, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Cornelius Vanderbilt, a handful of people owned the majority of the industry. So like John D. Rockefeller owned the oil industry. If he had a competitor, he would just run his competitor out of business. That's not capitalism. That's not competitive. So that's where we've learned that to a certain extent the government has to get involved. So most of the time, monopolies controlling all of one industry are not allowed, and they're broken up into smaller companies. Anti-competitive business practices like price fixing. Basically, if I own a car company and you own a car company, and we get together with each other and we say, hey, we're going to artificially fix the price for minivans at $25,000. You're not allowed to do that. The market is supposed to set the price, and I'm supposed to compete with my adversary to, make a better or a cheaper product. So you can't do anti-competitive things. But we've had to learn that lesson over time, and we're still learning. Okay. All right. So what's bad about capitalism? Well, there's no safety net in capitalism, at least not in its original sort of version. Um, Essentially, what you're going to get is an economy that will uplift a large number of people, but America in its at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and so by the late 1800s is just going to have masses of poor, disenfranchised, factory workers living in vast, squalid cities, working in dirty factories, and there is a huge gap between these, sort of legions of poor factory workers and the wealthy industrialists whose wealth they're producing. And so there needs to be more of a balance, right? Like those factory workers should have the opportunity for a better life too. I mean, theoretically, if they work hard, they should be able to access, success and not necessarily become rich, but have the opportunity to build a better life. They don't have that opportunity, during the late 19th century, what Mark Twain called the Gilded Age. So there's no safety net. If you're unsuccessful, you're really unsuccessful. There's a big gap between rich and poor. All right. Communism is kind of an economic system. Communism goes beyond economics in that it's also social It concerns, the government beyond just the economy. But most people, when they think of communism, they think of the economic aspects of communism. So, under a communist sort of command economy, all factors of production are owned by the group. So basically, like, society owns the factories, the workers themselves own the factories, all the factors of production, and the economy is planned. Basically, there's like a central body that decides where resources go and when, and everything is planned out. So, like in the Soviet Union, they had the 5-year increments where they would plan where resources would be allocated. And the theory is that everybody just kind of works, resources are pooled, and then those resources are evenly distributed. So Karl Marx and Max Engels kind of came up with this theory. Karl Marx is the most identified with the theory of communism. There's some problems with communism. Here's the Communist Manifesto by Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx. And it called for the abolition of property. So in theory, everything is collectively owned. Heavy progressive taxes, the abolition of inheritance, confiscation of property, and central banking, state-controlled communication and transportation, state-controlled education of the children. All right, and so like I said, communism goes beyond just an economic system. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels really believed that capitalist societies were going to tear each other apart. They were looking at the ugliness of those industrial cities. They were looking at the suffering of child laborers and men and women in these factories. They were seeing the labor movement and the strikes and all of the strife. And they said, it's only a matter of time before the capitalist countries destroy each other, that they fight wars and rip each other apart. And basically they said that the working class is going to rise up, what they called the proletariat, the working class, is going to rise up against the bourgeoisie, basically the wealthy elite, and overthrow them. And what's going to result is a workers' paradise where the industrial workers basically control society. Of course, things don't quite work out that way. All right. So they studied the history of the world's economies to draw these conclusions. All right. And so they believe they discovered an inevitable pattern or cycle in which the world went from basic collective ownership of things, to feudalism where the elite owned everything, to a continued sort of rule by the elite under capitalism, to a gradual transition to socialism, and then to communism. So this is what Marx thought would happen. Doesn't quite happen that way, though. Socialism is different than communism. And so sometimes people try to use these words interchangeably, but they're very different. So socialism is sort of like, think like the United States has a mixed economy. So we have an economy that is capitalist, but is also socialist. So like examples of socialized aspects of our economy include like police departments, fire departments, public education, public libraries. Those are socialized aspects of our economy, as in they are collectively paid for and owned by the public. There's just certain things that we've decided it's better if they're publicly controlled. You wouldn't want to have a privatized police force. You wouldn't want to have a privatized fire department. Why? Because, private industry operates for profit. And some things probably shouldn't operate for profit. So socialism is practiced to a varying degree in capitalist economies. How much should be socialized? How little should be socialized? That depends on you, right? So there are like some people that are very economically liberal. They're like, hey, we should have more socialized aspects of our economy. The big things you hear about now are like people say that healthcare should be socialized. And then you have economic conservatives who say, no, 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 it's better if it's privatized. And therein lies the debate. Internet. There are people that are suggesting that internet should be a public utility because arguably you can't live without it. And that the big companies, because it's not profitable, aren't bringing it out to areas that need it. So this is an ongoing debate. Socialism is an aspect of a communist system, except everything, remember, in a communist state is collectively owned. Um, and so there's the quote here: from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. It should say needs. Socialism is the stage between capitalism and communism, and it builds upon the previous system by nationalizing the means of production, corporations, resources, banks, etc., but not making everyone equal. People are paid wages based on several factors. All right, so not everybody's going to make the same wage. Um, uh, uh, Communism is from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. Everybody gets the same thing. So according to their deeds, according to their needs. Um, like I said, communism goes well beyond an economic system and attempts to control all aspects of society, including religion, speech, the press. So it's built around this idea that there's going to be this revolution by industrial workers against the elite. And so the consequence of that is that communist societies become pretty repressive. And what we're going to see down the road is all these communist regimes are going to be totalitarian states. All right. Karl Marx. So what's good about communism? Basic needs are met. Everybody gets a job. Everybody gets a house. Everybody gets health care, etc. That's a little idyllic, because even in a society based on communism, basic needs are not going to be met. Well, why? If everything's shared and resources are pooled and then distributed evenly, shouldn't everybody have their basic needs met? I mean, it might not be a very nice house. If you look in the background here, you see these concrete apartment blocks. Those are a common aspect of the Soviet landscape during the Cold War era. They would build these massive concrete apartment blocks, and people lived in not so nice apartments. But shouldn't basic needs be met? Why would we have people starving or homeless if theoretically everything is shared equally? Guess what? That's what happens. It doesn't work that way. Even in these communist states, not everybody's going to have a job, a house, healthcare, etc. Why? What's bad about communism? Well, one, there's a lack of choice. So you don't have the freedom to go and buy the brands of clothes you want, and it goes beyond that. There's no reward for being a better worker or punishment for being a slacker. So essentially what happens is like the central committee in, say, Soviet Russia says that we need you to plant X amount of acres of grain this year. You need to plant and harvest X amount of acres of grain. All right? You're the farmer. All you have to do is meet your quota. There's no financial reward for producing more grain. There's no punishment for producing less grain. You just have to sow X amount of acres of grain. So what are you going to do? You're just going to get the job done. You're going to just try to hurry up and get it done. And so you're going to put the seeds down. And if you sow seeds on land where there's not really going to be a viable crop, that's fine because you met your quota. And this is just one example, but it becomes widespread across the Soviet Union, where you get gross inefficiency in all of these industries. There's no
financial incentive for people to do better, for people to produce. So like an American farmer is going to manage scarce resources very carefully. A rational actor in the economy wants to make money. So a farmer in the American economy wants to do the best they can with the least amount of resources possible, to be as efficient as possible, to make the most profit. Whereas a Soviet farmer is going to be like, all right, I just need to get these seeds in the ground. You know, you can see where the problem is here. Everybody is expected to be the same. There's not a lot of creativity. And there is creativity in the Soviet system and under communism, but it's in spite of and not because of. And so the people living in these societies are, frequently punished. Poets, actors, artists are branded enemies of the people, because they don't necessarily encourage folks to follow the Communist Party line. Something else that you run into with communism that's bad is, sorry, I didn't mean to flip forward, is something called the tragedy of the commons, right? And this is a popular argument against communism. Let's say that, I had a big bowl of candy in the front of the room, or like a pizza might be a little bit better because you guys are teenagers. So, like, let's say I had a pizza in the front of the room. All right, there's 10 of you, and there's 12 pieces of pizza. All right, and I say, hey, you can have as much as you want, right? Like, we're going to share this pizza. What are you going to do? Like, somebody's going to take two. Or you guys might be polite. Probably not. There's going to be people that are like, I'm going to look out for number one. So it's just sort of human nature that anything shared equally is not going to be conserved. People are just going to use it up because it's this idea that if I don't, somebody else will. The tragedy of the commons, they call it. And so that means that if you're going to collectively share something, you have to ration it. So in this case, I would have to be like, all right, there's 10 of you, there's 12 pieces of pizza, everybody could take one, and then I'm going to take the other two, So rationing means that somebody's going to be in charge of the rationing. Which in a communist society, everybody's supposed to be the same. They're all supposed to be on the level. But, in theory, if somebody is in charge of rationing, that person is really the one that's in charge. And that's why, like I said, what you end up with are dictatorships in these communist states where people aren't equal and they're totalitarian. So it just goes against human nature. Capitalism is essentially good. The market is a really good way to allocate resources, supply and demand, make things run efficiently. We just have to address those issues with capitalism that we run into. Like, hey, workers should work in safe conditions. There should be set work hours. Child labor should be illegal. People's health is important. The environment is important. Sometimes the dollar tells us to do not so good things, like abuse workers, abuse the environment, etc. So we have to have some level of regulation of that free market to ensure that everybody gets a chance to pursue happiness and benefit from capitalism. Now, how much regulation or how little regulation should we have? Well, that just depends on your values. You might be economically liberal or economically conservative. There's not necessarily a right or wrong. It's sort of a values thing. So you just kind of have to decide based on your beliefs. But for sure, communism is a disproven theory. Certain things, like I said, within our economy are socialized, and that's to the benefit of society. What should be or shouldn't be is also a values question. Okay. So how is this related to the Industrial Revolution? Adam Smith's capitalism dominated the Industrial Revolution. If you had a good, successful business, there were no regulations. You could treat your workers any way you wanted. This led to bad working conditions. Marx said communism was a solution to the problems of capitalism. That's a little bit extreme. Marx said the workers are eventually going to get fed up. They're going to overthrow their governments and start communism. He said that is the cycle of history. All right. And you can kind of see the idea here, right? So the pyramid of a capitalist system, this is a political cartoon to kind of show that, I mean, this is a true sentiment in the 1800s. The workers are at the bottom. They're the ones that feed everybody, that clothe everybody, that provide everybody, right? And then you've got upper class sort of people who are sort of well-to-do, who are living off of the workers, okay? Then, and this is a common thing, even in the United States, frequently in the United States, the military is used to break up strikes, to go in and break up strikes and open up factories, right? And then they said that, it says that religion is being used to sort of placate the masses and argue that. And in fact, there is a very famous preacher at the time. His name is Russell Conwell, and he writes a book called Acres of Diamonds, and where he essentially says that, hey, poor people are poor because they're bad. So he argues that he actually says there's not a single man in America. This is back in the late 1800s, by the way. He says there's not a single man in the United States who's poor, who is basically poor. Talk myself into kind of a tongue-tied myself here. So he said that basically poor people in America are poor because of bad decisions that they've made, not because they live in squalid conditions in terrible factories where the factory owners pay them practically nothing and work them 18 hours a day, right? It can't be that. It has to be the poor. They're the reason. So he basically says that they're bad, and he says that the reason that the wealthy people are wealthy is because he actually says they're the best people in society. He says rich people are rich because they're the most honest. Okay? And if you're reading right now, you should be like Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, Vanderbilt. They were not honest people. All right? They were cutthroat, ruthless. They definitely did many, many dishonest things to work their way to the top. And then, so you've got these wealthy sort of elites up here at the top, and then at the top of everything, money rules all. All right, and so this is sort of a criticism of capitalism, right? And again, what we're going to find out is that, capitalism is the best way to manage an economy, but folks are going to have to step in and say, hey, you've got to pay these guys reasonable wages. They have to have safe working conditions, reasonable working hours. They've got to have decent places to live. They've got to have access to the good life, right? And so after considerable strife around the world, this labor movement is going to kind of establish a lot of those things. Now, arguably, we haven't perfected this yet, and the debate goes on, and there's always things within our economy that need to be addressed. We're constantly sort of having to go back to the drawing board and say, hey, you know what, we can do this a little bit better. One of the best examples is the environment, where we're kind of recognizing that, hey, thinking long term, if we don't start to put things in place, then we're going to wreck the ecology, and ultimately that's going to be self-defeating. So sometimes, a little intervention is required. All right, let's take a look at imperialism. And so what we see moving into this time period is imperialism. Remember, we talked about nationalism.
that is pride or devotion to one's nation. So what is imperialism? I always say with imperialism, might makes right. I'm bigger than you, I'm stronger than you, and so it's my way or the highway. And there's different types of imperialism. So you can have political imperialism, basically where you send your military into a foreign country and take it over because you can, because you're stronger. Or there's economic imperialism, right? Which is where you essentially send in your dollars. You use the power of your economy to take over another country because you're stronger, because you can. All right, so colonizing a land that doesn't belong to you, making it a territory of your land. You don't necessarily have to colonize it. You don't necessarily have to take it over. You can take it over with your money. There's economic imperialism too. All right, so why did imperialism become popular? Well, the Industrial Revolution is going on. All right, European nations, nationalistic European nations, are motivated to compete with each other for colonial possessions because they want raw materials. Remember when I talked to you guys about like mercantilism and the greedy octopus reaching out with its colonies to try to get wealth and resources? That's still going on. European economic, military, and political power forced colonized countries to trade on European terms. They want to reach out to these colonial places and get timber and tea and oil and rubber and cotton and all the goods so that they can produce finished goods in their factories and then turn around and sell those finished goods right back to those places that they've colonized. All right. And so industrial produced goods flooded colonial markets and displaced traditional industries. Colonized peoples are going to resist European domination and respond in a number of different ways to Western influence. So this is not a one-way relationship. These places that are going to be colonized are going to continually push back against European imperialism. Industrial nations in Europe needed natural resources and markets. So they need all those resources that are found all around the world to fuel their factories, and then they need people to sell all those finished goods to. So that's going to drive imperialism. Look at that. Greedy octopus, reaching out to Egypt, cotton, reaching out to India, tea, furs in Canada, right? Basically, the arms of the greedy octopus are reaching out all around the world to grab resources to produce finished goods at factories in England. Well, and then, by the way, we're going to sell those goods right back to markets all over the world. Okay, I'm scribbling. So, one form of imperialism are colonies. Check it out. Colonies are the tentacles. Colonies are the tentacles. Look, see Jamaica? Okay. All right. So a county or territory, or a country rather, or territory governed by a foreign power. It's a tentacle. It's a way that a country can reach out and occupy another country. Most were established for the benefit of the mother country. Remember, the colony is the tentacle. The tentacle exists to benefit the head of the octopus, not the other way around. All right, during this time, the mother country looked for supplies to fuel the Industrial Revolution at home. You also have protectorates. All right, think like a protectorate is like it's a parent-child relationship. So this is like what the United States does to Panama. The United States says, hey, Panama, declare independence from Colombia, and we'll protect you. We will shepherd you, but in exchange, we want to sign a treaty for the Panama Canal. So it's a country or territory with its own internal government, but it's still under the control of an outside power. And it's likely that the outside power established the government in place to mirror their own. So even though we encourage Panama to declare independence, we're going to be heavily involved in Panamanian affairs. We're going to kick the Spanish out of Cuba, but we're going to be heavily involved in Cuban affairs. And this is the case with European countries too. They're going to establish protectorates, but the governments of those protectorates are going to be heavily influenced by and really be put in place by European governments. So they're quote unquote puppet governments. You also have spheres of influence. A sphere of influence is an area in which an outside power claims exclusive investment or trading privileges. Now, this is, and I use the United States as an example a lot. I'm a U.S. history teacher, like the Monroe Doctrine, where the United States said European nations should stay out of the Americas. They're not up for grabs. Europeans should not colonize the Western Hemisphere. And the United States asserted its right to get involved in Latin American affairs. So we claim that the Western Hemisphere to Latin America was our sphere of influence. All right. And so the mother country doesn't inflict its government or full control, but it uses something such as resources. So it basically says this is our neighborhood, our neck of the woods. So like England might say, India, you know, in the Asian subcontinent, this is our sphere of influence, and we don't want other countries coming here and trying to trade or trying to establish influence. You're going to see some conflict with that later on. Like Russia is going to try to extend its influence southward via Afghanistan, and so you're going to see some conflict there as a result of that. All right, imperialism in Africa and Asia. You get European domination during the 19th to early 20th century. European nations are going to use their power to dominate places in Africa and Asia for their benefit. Remember, stronger countries dominated the political, economic, and social life of weaker countries, especially in Africa. European countries are going to basically conspire with each other to divide up Africa amongst themselves. They're going to hold, it's called the Berlin Conference. They're going to gather together and basically carve up Africa with zero consultation with leaders of those African states. They're going to superimpose borders over Africa without regard to existing cultural patterns or ethnic groups. And that's going to create all kinds of strife later on. And then they're going to set up infrastructure in Africa to extract resources. Europeans also believe they're superior. You have something called scientific racism that well, it still exists, but it was rampant back then. And that's essentially where they try to use science to show that Europeans were somehow inherently superior to other peoples of the world, and use that as an excuse to imperialize these other countries. You also get something called social Darwinism, which is the idea that remember Darwin talks about survival of the fittest, the evolution of species. And so people will say, well, Europeans are the fittest, and so they have a right, based on social Darwinism, they have a right to these lands, even though they belong to other people, because the Europeans are the quote unquote fittest, it's their right to take them. And of course, these beliefs are just misguided excuses to take what belongs to other people. All right. So, like I said, the Berlin Conference is a good example. The Europeans were competing fiercely over colonies. And so to prevent conflict, 14 European nations and 0 African nations met at the Berlin Conference, 1884 to 1885, to divide Africa amongst themselves. They set the rules for the division of Africa. Now, you got to kind of think of the arrogance, essentially saying, hey, we're dividing it up amongst ourselves. No Africans were consulted. The borders that they impose in Africa pay no attention to existing cultures and language groups and ethnic groups. So they just arbitrarily apply borders over Africa without any regard to the pre-existing, demographics. And that's going to create the ethnic strife and conflict all the way up until today. All right, so here's the Berlin Conference. Here's those borders that I was talking about, where they're basically like, hey, okay, you got,
arbitrarily applying borders. One example that's going to be a problem in the is conflict in Rwanda in the 90s. And so what ends up happening is Rwanda, it's not carved out during the Berlin Conference, but the Conference of Brussels in 1890. And essentially becomes part of German East Africa. And so what they do is they sort of arbitrarily draw these borders, and then they put the Tutsi minority in charge, and basically make them the colonial administrators. They did this because the Tutsi ethnic group was slightly lighter skinned than the Hutu majority. And what ends up happening is obviously there's a strong hatred that develops between the Tutsi minority and the Hutu majority. And so even after the period of colonization, those hatreds persist. And you end up with a famine in the 1990s, and you end up with the Rwanda genocide, where something like 1 million people are murdered in 100 days, largely due to decisions that are being made right now in the late 19th century. So significant damage is done through the arbitrary application of these borders, through the carving up of Africa for colonization and for the extraction of resources. So imperialism in Africa and Asia, part of it is Christian and missionary efforts. This is more or less an excuse to take over land. So prior to the mid-1800s, Europeans didn't enter into the interior of Africa. It's hard to do. And to this day, much of the African interior remains unexplored rather. I mean, the rainforest represents a contiguous geographic feature that is larger than the United States. It really defied efforts by even modern tools like remote sensing, with satellites to peer into it. And so you can imagine in the 19th century, really effectively exploring the African interior would have been difficult. So people start to explore, start to push inward, and missionaries were sent to convert African people to Christianity. All right, in China, there are also attempts to expand European spheres of influence. Europeans and Japanese are competing to establish spheres of influence in China. So they wanted to control trade and control investment. And the United States doesn't want to get left out. And so the United States at this time is becoming a formidable power. And so they institute the open door policy with China, in which they say, hey, you can't carve up China the way you did in Africa. China at this time is in sort of a weakened state, so the United States is worried that the European nations and Japan will try to carve up China amongst themselves, and the United States is going to get left out. So the U.S. says, hey, you have to respect Chinese law and observe fair trade in China. They're not really doing that for the benefit of the Chinese. They're doing that to make sure the United States gets a seat at the table. So the rising influence of foreigners in China leads to some resentment among the peasant classes. And you're actually going to get a peasant revolt called the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer Rebellion is actually a group. They're called the Righteous and Harmonious Fists. And they sort of practice a type of calisthenics that includes, some boxing. And so foreigners called it the Boxing Rebellion. But it really stems from resentment of the growing influence of foreigners within China. A big part of this resentment is the result of Christian missionaries. So a lot of Chinese peasants took exception to Christian missionaries basically flouting traditional Chinese ceremonies and family relations, and pressuring local officials to side with Chinese converts
who were often from lower classes of Chinese society. And so the Boxers see this, and they basically they want to expel Christians from China and revolt against this growing Western influence. There's not really a uniform Chinese government response to this. Remember that at this time, China is not the strong state that it is today. So, like the Empress, sort of sides with the Boxers and orders imperial troops to block an international force that's sent by these foreign countries to fight against the Boxers. Meanwhile, you've got imperial viceroys of China who are defying those orders and characterizing the rebellion as just a native revolt that is isolated to northern China and that it doesn't reflect the policy of China. So there's a lot of disagreement amongst the Chinese leadership when it comes to the Boxer Rebellion. Some support it, some are against it. Ultimately, an international force of about 19,000 troops was assembled. And most of these troops came from Japan and Russia, but they included troops from Britain, the United States, France, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And on August 14th, 1900, they captured Beijing, and basically relieving foreigners and Christians that had been besieged there since that June. They looted the capital. The royal court had to flee, and eventually they were forced to sign a protocol. The Chinese Dowager Empress was forced to sign a protocol which ended the hostilities and paid reparations to the foreign powers. So essentially, foreign powers invaded China, put down a nativist sort of revolt in China, and forced the Chinese to pay them for damages done. And so you can see at this time that there is a strong international presence in China. There are spheres of influence carved out in China. European powers and the Japanese are vying for control of China. All right. In Africa, the Suez Canal is another point of interest. So Napoleon failed to take Egypt, and a new leader emerged in the form of Muhammad Ali. And he begins to reform Egypt, and he wanted to modernize Egypt. All right. And his grandson, Ismail, takes up the torch and continues these modernization efforts. So a man-made waterway, the Suez Canal, is built. This cuts through the Isthmus of Suez, connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. It opens in 1869 and becomes the lifeline of the empire. Indeed, it is a very, very important waterway right up until this day. Now Britain has quicker access to its colonies in Asia and Africa. So very strategic waterway. The East India Company dominates the Indian trade. So Britain still has links in India in the mid-1800s. Remember that for a time, there was a lot of sort of competition in India. You had the British East India Company. There was a French East India Company. These joint stock companies, what we would call corporations today, had entire armies, and they were fighting with each other for control. This, like I said, this would be like if McDonald's and Burger King had mercenary armies and were fighting a turf war, over who was going to dominate the fast food industry. Not a perfect analogy, but it's good enough, right? So the British end up during the 7 Years' War establishing exclusive control over India and become the dominant force there. The British government regulated but didn't really interfere with the East India Company. So its power and control is going to grow over time. Britain becomes a very key part, or rather India becomes a key part of the British Empire. It was called the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. Meanwhile, the United States is going to open up trade with Japan. So Japan had strictly isolated itself from foreign influence, and only the Dutch really had minimal access to Japanese trade, and those were on some offshore islands. Well, in the 19th century, so in the 1850s, U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry is going to sail his modern fleet of coal-fired ships into the harbor at Uraga and demand that the Japanese establish trade with the United States. This is a pivotal moment. So and in Japan they're called the black ships because of the black color of the older sailing vessels and the black smoke from the coal-fired steam engines of the American ships. They're called the black ships. And they become a symbol to the Japanese. So this is kind of a moment of national humiliation because there's nothing that the Japanese can really do in response to the black ships other than meet the demands of the Americans and open up Japan for trade. They are forced to let go of their policy of isolationism, but they're not going to forget the black ships. And so Japan is going to set itself on a course of modernization, and they are going to rapidly industrialize. They're going to send people all over the world to go to colleges in the United States and Great Britain to learn the modern naval warfare, modern military doctrine. They're going to have people come in and they're going to establish modern industry. And Japan, in just a couple decades, is going to become a force to be reckoned with. And so it's in, I think, 1854 that the black ships arrive in the harbor of Uraga. And by, I think 1904, 1905, Japan is going to become just as powerful as any other country on earth. And they're going to soundly defeat the Russians at the Battle of Tsushima. So Japan is going to rapidly modernize as a result of this occurrence. All right, well, partially as a result of this occurrence. You guys can skip over this. All right, so resistance to imperialism is going to take a lot of force, including armed conflict. So as foreign influence grew in China, poor peasants and workers revolted. Remember, we talked about the Boxer Rebellion. The United States is going to push for an open door policy in China. Remember that this is meant to look out for American trading rights in China, not necessarily out of respect to Chinese law. All right, so the Chinese developed the Society of the Righteous Harmonious Fist, aka the Boxers. They have a peasant rebellion. Churches are burned, missionaries are expelled, they're besieged in Beijing. Ultimately, a 19,000 strong foreign force is sent into China to force the Chinese government to capitulate. All right, so the Boxer Rebellion in China. Boxers campaigned against the Dowager Empress, and foreign privilege became known as the Boxer Rebellion. So in 1900, they descend on Beijing and surrounded the European section of the city. They kept it under siege for several months. 19,000 foreign troops marched in and defeat the Boxers, and as a result, the Dowager Empress is forced to sign protocols that favor foreigners. Reparations have to be paid, but a strong sense of nationalism emerged in China, where people are basically saying, hey, the government needs to be responsive to the needs of Chinese, not to those of foreign powers. And so, just like with the black ships in Japan, the Boxer Rebellion, though put down, is going to have a lasting effect. And nationalism in China is going to grow. All right. In India, you're going to see a nationalist party form in the mid-1800s. With British control, more Indians are going to demand modernization and a greater role in governing themselves.
They didn't want India to be controlled by outsiders. So they're led by Ram Mohan Roy, who's called the father of modern India. And we're going to see two nationalist groups form. That's the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League. Remember that during this time period, well, and even today, there's a significant Muslim population in India. But before what we'll talk about the partition, um, there's a significantly large number of Muslims and Hindus living in India together. And so these are the two large groups. And they are going to concentrate on concerns for Indians, and later they're going to call for self-government. So the roots of decolonization are being sowed here. But we've got a couple of world wars to fight, before that's going to happen. So European nations competed to control Africa and Asia in order to secure their own economic and political success. Imperialism spread the economic, political, and social philosophies of Europe throughout the world. All right, and resistance to imperialism took many forms, including armed conflict and intellectual movements. And we'll see a lot of these movements that are starting during this period of imperialism come to fruition after World War I and World War II. The period after World War I and after World War II, up until the late 20th century, are referred to as decolonization. All right, guys. So that concludes our industrialization and imperialism lecture. Make sure that you guys do the guide and notes. Make sure you do the discussion board, and make sure you answer the chapter questions. And I will see you next time.